The chandeliers over the copper room cast liquid gold across a kingdom built on velvet and secrets. It's past midnight in the summer of 1965, and the Sands Hotel pulses with the kind of dangerous electricity that only Las Vegas could generate. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of money, real money, the kind that never sees daylight, that travels in handshakes and shallow graves. At center stage, Dean Martin leans against the microphone stand like it's an old friend, his tuxedo jacket open, tie loose, that crooked grin playing at the edge of his mouth like a private joke with eternity. To the tourists packed into the back booths, Dean looks drunk, as always. That's the act they paid for. The stumbling charm, the slurred asides, the martini glass catching stage lights like liquid amber. But the regulars know better. The glass often holds apple juice. The stumble is choreographed. The timing of every pause, every tilt of the head, is a surgeon's precision hidden inside a comedian's shrug. It's the most fragile magic of all, making your own burden the audience's escape. The orchestra swells behind him like silk, and Dean begins Everybody Loves Somebody. Frank Sinatra watches from a corner table with the lazy pride of a man witnessing the only performer cooler than himself. Waitresses move in perfect choreography, drinks appearing and disappearing like expensive miracles. Everything is choreographed perfection, the kind of effortless immortality that made America fall in love with a coal miner's son from Steubenville, Ohio. Then, halfway through a joke about his golf game, the room changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, just shifts. Near the side entrance, a constellation of dark suits gathers, men who never need menus, who never wait for checks, who move through the desert kingdom like sharks through shallow water. At their center sits a figure whose presence makes even the pit bosses look away, a man whose name federal agents whisper, but never write down. This is Anthony Tony, the Ant Spilotro's most trusted associate, a ghost who controls the desert with a handshake and a shallow grave. A low murmur reaches the stage, nothing the microphones could catch, but enough to reach a man whose survival depends on hearing what people try not to say. A pit boss leans toward the maitre d', who glances toward the stage manager, and in that tiny chain of anxious looks, Dean Martin understands the deadliest man in Nevada has just made the most dangerous demand in Las Vegas. A free show, not a comp stake, not a reserved table. Power, declared in public. Everyone in the room does the same mathematics. If the boss gets it for free, the house looks weak. If the house refuses, someone dies. Someone always dies in the desert. The band keeps playing, but Dean has already left the building. Not with his body, with his eyes. For the first time that night, the King of Cool goes very still. The smile stays, but something behind it clicks off, like a light disappearing in a hallway you didn't know you were walking down. He finishes the joke. The audience laughs on cue, unaware that their easy laughter now hangs over a razor. Backstage, between songs, the message is delivered by a man in a suit that costs more than most cars. The request comes wrapped in the kind of politeness that freezes blood, a private performance, tomorrow night at the boss's estate. No charge, of course, because friends don't charge friends, and everyone in Las Vegas is a friend whether they want to be or not. Other performers would have said yes immediately. Frank, for all his bravado, would have kissed the ring. Sammy would have danced until his feet bled. But Dean Martin wasn't like the others. He was the only man in Hollywood who played drunk to hide the fact that he was the soberest man in the room. Instead of calling his manager or summoning security, Dean takes out a piece of Sands Hotel stationery. His movements are so smooth, they look like part of the act. He writes something, not a refusal, not an acceptance, something else entirely. Something so unexpected, so perfectly Dean, that when it reaches the hitman's hands, the stone-faced killer does something his associates have never witnessed. He laughs, a real laugh, deep and genuine, the kind that comes from pure surprise. And in that moment, in a city built on fear and compromise, One perfectly chosen sentence from a so-called drunk singer accomplishes what bullets and bravado never could. It keeps everyone alive, preserves everyone's dignity, and proves that sometimes the quietest voice carries the most weight. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that night in 1965 to the Copa Room at the Sands and discover how a piece of hotel stationery became more powerful than any weapon in the Nevada desert. Las Vegas in 1965 was sold to the world as America's playground, but the people who lived and worked there understood a different truth. It was a company town built with Teamster pension funds and decisions made in rooms where nobody took minutes, and certain names were never spoken above a whisper. The Sands Hotel stood as the crown jewel of this arrangement, where the ownership papers said one thing and reality whispered another. Every cocktail waitress, every pit boss, every performer who walked those stages knew there were two audiences every night: the paying crowd and the men in the shadows whose approval could make or break you before the final curtain fell. The Strip wasn't just entertainment. It was a carefully orchestrated ballet of power and survival. Tourists flew in from Des Moines and Detroit convinced they were witnessing pure magic, unaware they were watching performers navigate a minefield where the wrong joke, the wrong refusal, the wrong display of independence could end more than just a career. The men in tailored suits at the back tables didn't sign contracts, they nodded. They didn't raise their voices, they raised their eyebrows. Their power wasn't theatrical, it was atmospheric, changing the oxygen in every room they entered. For the stars who called this desert kingdom home, the mob wasn't a terrifying secret, it was just the Tuesday shift. Frank Sinatra survived through volatile charm and dangerous friendships, playing the power game because he wanted to be a power player himself. Sammy Davis Jr. performed an even more precarious dance, navigating not just the underworld but the color line, saying yes to requests because saying no meant losing access to the only stages that would have him. Every performer developed their own survival strategy, their own method of bending without breaking. The man who would send that message to Dean Martin's dressing room wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a legitimate architect of violence, someone whose business cards were unnecessary because everyone already knew his name or knew better than to ask. He controlled unions that built the hotels, ran books that financed the shows, and settled disputes with methods that left no paperwork. When he walked into a casino, the very air seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. A retired security chief from those years, sitting decades later in a small apartment in Henderson, would capture the entire era in a single breath. In those days, saying no to the wrong person wasn't career suicide, it was just suicide. Most guys understood that. You didn't get blacklisted, you got erased. That was the calculus everyone lived with. Into this world walked Dean Martin, looking like the one man untouched by any of it. He wandered onto stages like he'd just happened to stroll through a casino and decided to sing a few tunes. The loosened tie, the tilted glass, the easy grin, it all said the same thing. None of this is heavy. None of this matters. We're just here to have a beautiful, careless time. But that effortless warmth that made every man in the audience feel like his drinking buddy was also his greatest liability. The mob didn't just want his voice. They wanted his validation. They wanted the king of cool to bow, just a little, to show the room who really held the crown. Dean had watched what happened to performers who became too available, too eager to please. He'd seen careers that started as favors end as obligations. He knew that the moment you become a court jester, you cease to be a king. So when that demand came for a free private show, Dean didn't reach for the phone to call his agent. He didn't panic or negotiate. He reached for a pen, because Dean Martin had already decided long before that night that he might sing for almost anyone, but he would belong to no one. The greatest magic trick in Hollywood history happened every night in plain sight, so perfect that even people who worked with Dean Martin for years never quite caught the sleight of hand. The martini glass caught the spotlight like liquid amber, and Dean would sway just enough to make the tourists lean forward with delighted concern. He'd slur a word here, forget a lyric there, laugh at his own stumbling as if the whole evening were one gorgeous, careless accident. America fell in love with a man who seemed perpetually 3 drinks past caring, when the truth was that most nights that famous glass held nothing stronger than apple juice mixed with just enough vermouth to catch the scent. The stumble was choreographed down to the inch. The forgotten lyrics were planned beats where the orchestra could shine. The seemingly careless timing of every pause, every tilt of the head, every crooked grin was precision disguised as improvisation. Dean had learned early that a drunk man gets forgiven for anything. A drunk man can insult a senator, walk away from a conversation, tell uncomfortable truths, and everyone just smiles and says, "That's Dino being Dino." The mask wasn't just protection, it was freedom. This strategic performance was forged in the steel mills of Steubenville, Ohio, where young Dino Crescetti watched his immigrant father break his back for wages that barely fed the family. Before the lights of Vegas, he was Kid Crochet in cheap boxing rings, taking punches until his nose was permanently broken and his knuckles were scarred maps of survival. In that world, you learned quickly that the loudest man is rarely the strongest, and the man who survives is the one who knows when to go quiet. That quiet dignity revealed itself in moments the cameras never captured. On a film set in the late 50s, an assistant director humiliated an extra in front of the entire crew. Most stars would have looked away. Dean stopped mid-rehearsal, the lazy grin disappearing like smoke. He walked over, put a gentle hand on the extra's shoulder, and said, almost like a bedtime story, "If he goes, I go." No raised voice, no speech, just a line in the sand drawn with surgical precision. The extra stayed. The tone of the set changed forever. A Vegas musician, interviewed half a century later, still remembered the envelope that arrived at his apartment after his wife's cancer diagnosis. No note inside, just cash and a room number to call if they needed more. "We knew it was Dino," he said, eyes wet with memory. But he never said a word about it. Just asked how the missus was doing and changed the subject. These weren't grand gestures staged for applause. They were quiet stands taken in shadows. Rehearsals paused until backup singers got paid. Club dates canceled when black performers were denied hotel rooms. Phone calls made in dead of night to fix what other men had broken. To the public, Dean Martin was the patron saint of beautiful indifference. To the people who worked in his orbit, he was something much rarer. A man whose cool was not cruelty, whose distance was not disregard, whose supposed carelessness was actually a relentless, silent accounting of what was right and what was not. So when Dean sat at that dressing room table, hotel stationery spread before him like a battlefield, he wasn't processing the demand as Dino the drunk or the king of cool. He was the steelworker's son who understood that if you let a bully take your lunch money once, you'll be hungry for the rest of your life. The note he was about to write would come from the most sober man in Las Vegas, quietly deciding that even in a city of necessary compromises, some lines his soul would never cross. The dressing room at the Sands was never truly quiet, even with the door shut tight against the carnival of noise outside. Sound seeped through the walls like cigarette smoke, muffled laughter from the showroom, the distant symphony of slot machines, dealers calling bets somewhere out on the casino floor. But when the messenger delivered his polite, dangerous request, everything around Dean Martin seemed to fall into a heavy, cathedral stillness that made even his own breathing sound too loud. The man stood just inside the doorway, hat in his hands, trying to look casual and failing completely. He repeated the words he'd been given, soft and courteous, but edged with a kind of expectation that turned politeness into pressure. "The boss wants a private show. Tomorrow night. His house. No charge, of course, because friends don't charge friends, and in Las Vegas, everyone was a friend whether they wanted to be or not." For the first time that night, Dean let the mask slip entirely. The easy grin faded, the shoulders straightened. The man who made everything look effortless suddenly looked like what he'd always been underneath, a steelworker's son who understood that some battles are won not by fighting, but by refusing to fight on someone else's terms. He could have called Jack Entratter, let casino management handle it with the delicate choreography they'd perfected over years of similar situations. A comp suite, a private table, some face-saving arrangement that would make everyone look generous while keeping the real power structure intact. He could have sent his manager to negotiate, turned the whole thing into a business discussion where nobody lost face and nobody won freedom. Or he could have simply said yes, shown up at the estate with his guitar and his smile, done an hour of greatest hits, and walked away with his career intact and his dignity buried in the Nevada desert. But Dean had spent his entire life watching what happened to men who bent once and then couldn't stop bending. He'd seen legends in this very casino reduced to court jesters who jumped when the right people snapped their fingers. One private show led to another, and another. A favor became an obligation. You became furniture in someone else's house. Instead, he waved the messenger toward the couch, not unkindly, then turned to the vanity where a piece of sand stationery waited like a battlefield. There was no discussion with agents or studio heads. Dean understood something everyone else in Las Vegas pretended not to know. There are conversations that become more dangerous the more people you drag into them. This required the most radical approach of all, honesty delivered with style. The pen moved across the paper with the same unhurried grace he used to light a cigarette. He wasn't writing a refusal, he was writing a redefinition of terms. I appreciate the invitation, but I only perform on stages I can walk off of. Nothing personal, I hope you understand. If you'd like to see the show, I'm at the Sands every night. First drinks on me. Best, Dean. It was a high-wire act performed in blue ink, acknowledging the man's power without bowing to it, saying no without declaring war. He folded the paper with surgical precision and handed it to the terrified messenger with that familiar half-smile back in place. The walk across the casino floor felt longer than any desert highway. The enforcer took the note with the detachment of a man used to bad news and worse excuses. His associates leaned in, already prepared for the small nod that would mean serious trouble for the singer in the Copa room. For a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, there was only silence as his eyes moved across the page. Then something impossible happened in a city built on fear and compromise. The man who scared federal agents threw his head back and laughed, not with cruelty, but with genuine surprise. In a town of sycophants and terrified yes-men, someone had finally spoken to him like a human being capable of understanding simple dignity. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his breast pocket, not as evidence, but as something valuable he intended to keep. The war was over before it started, diffused by the one weapon nobody in Vegas knew how to fight, absolute, unshakable integrity wrapped in a wink. The news spread through the sands, not in shouts, but in changed expressions. In a town where survival depended on pretending you hadn't seen anything, people noticed everything. The expected retaliation never arrived. No mysterious accidents on desert highways. No sudden pressure on contracts. No phone calls from men who began every sentence with out of respect. Instead, something even stranger occurred. Something that would rewrite the unspoken rules of the Desert Kingdom. 2 nights later, the Copa Room held its collective breath as the doors opened for the evening show. The band knew. The mater knew. Every waiter carrying drinks moved with the nervous energy of someone waiting for a bomb to go off. Then, halfway through the usual pre-show bustle, the enforcer walked through the front entrance like any other patron. No entourage blocking aisles. No tables cleared by terrified managers. He approached the maitre d', pulled out his wallet, and did something that nearly made the staff drop their trays. He bought a ticket. An actual ticket. Cash. No discount. No whispered arrangement. No reminder of who he was or what he could do. He took a table with a clear view of the stage, ordered drinks, tipped the cocktail waitress generously, and when Dean walked into the spotlight with that same lazy confidence he always wore, something extraordinary happened. The man who federal agents only ever saw stone-faced was smiling. Not the predatory smile of power, but something softer, almost wistful. When Dean caught his eye during the applause, there was the tiniest pause, a minimal lift of the glass so small it could have been a trick of the lights, and then Dean went right back into the song. It was not deference. It was not victory. It was recognition between two men who understood that respect flows both ways or it doesn't flow at all. That single, almost invisible exchange rewrote the map of the room. Here was the most feared man in Nevada, sitting in the dark like any other patron, watching a man on stage who had somehow managed to say no and survive. When a drunk tourist near the front started heckling during a ballad, it wasn't security who moved first. It was a simple, quiet gesture from that table that silenced the room instantly. The message was unmistakable. Dean Martin was not property. Not even here. Not even now. The story moved through Las Vegas like wind through canyon walls, picking up speed and significance with every retelling. Other performers heard it and, for the first time, allowed themselves to imagine a boundary. They couldn't all pull off what Dean had accomplished. His particular alchemy required decades of goodwill, a reputation for fairness that made even dangerous men want to prove they could be reasonable. But his example planted a fragile seed. Maybe certain lines could be drawn. Maybe not every request had to end in surrender. In whispered dressing room conversations and late-night bar talks among musicians and comics, a new phrase began to appear. What would Dean do? The changes were microscopic, almost invisible from the outside. A comedian politely declining a late-night summons he would have previously felt forced to accept. A bandleader insisting on payment up front for a favor gig. The son of a casino pit boss, now an old man himself, would recall decades later how his father came home that night looking different than usual. My dad was a tough guy, but he lived scared. Everyone did. That night, he sat at the kitchen table and told my mom, Dino didn't blink. He just didn't blink. It changed how my father walked through that casino. He stood a little straighter after that. What made the moment truly revolutionary was the strange, unspoken respect that developed between the singer and the enforcer. The mobster became a regular, always buying tickets, always sitting as a paying guest, never asking for special treatment, never again sending messages for private favors. He understood the terms of the peace treaty Dean had written. I respect you as a customer. You respect me as a man. And we meet in the middle, in the music. Dean never spoke about it publicly. He never turned it into a talk show anecdote or used it to polish his tough guy credentials. To do so would have cheapened the act, turned a moment of integrity into a marketing strategy. He simply went back to work, back to the jokes and the songs, back to pretending he was just a lucky drunk stumbling through life. But years later, when federal agents finally put the enforcer in handcuffs and went through his belongings, they found something that stopped them cold. Among the expected items, cash, identification, photographs of family, was a piece of Sands Hotel stationery, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft, the ink faded, but the words still legible. During interrogation, they asked him about it. Why keep a note from a singer? What did it mean? The man who had spent his life in calculated silence just smiled and shook his head. That? He said quietly. That's just a reminder. Some things aren't for sale. His grandson would find that note decades later, going through boxes after the old man's death. He held it up to the light, reading his grandfather's name at the top in Dean's distinctive handwriting, and something shifted in how he understood the man he'd feared and loved. If Dean Martin could see something human in my grandfather, he said years later, voice thick with complicated grief, maybe there was something there worth saving. Maybe he wasn't just what the newspapers said he was. The note had traveled from a Vegas dressing room to a federal evidence locker to a grandson's trembling hands, and at every stop it carried the same quiet message that dignity offered can sometimes be dignity returned, that treating a dangerous man like a human being is the most dangerous gamble of all, and that sometimes, in a city built entirely on illusions, the truth spoken simply can be the most powerful magic trick ever performed. Some loyalties, the old man had understood, were bigger than the life he'd chosen. Some moments of genuine human connection mattered more than any deal he could cut with prosecutors or any reputation he could preserve. In the end, a killer had kept Dean's words closer than a gun, and that said more about both men than any roast or record or federal indictment ever could. The note mattered because it was the first time in years someone had spoken to the enforcer as if he were capable of understanding something beyond fear. In his world of calculated violence and purchased loyalty, every conversation was a negotiation, every smile a transaction. People either cowered or performed friendship while their eyes betrayed terror. Dean had done neither. He'd simply drawn a line and trusted the man on the other side to respect it, as if respect were still possible between a crooner and a killer. The grandson who found that note, decades later, sorting through boxes that smelled of old leather and complicated regret, held it like archaeologists hold fragments of lost civilizations. The paper had been handled so often it felt like fabric, the folds worn smooth as river stones from years of being read and reread in hotel rooms in quiet moments when the mask his grandfather wore for the world finally came off. "If Dean Martin could see something human in my grandfather," the grandson said during an interview years later, voice catching on the weight of discovery, maybe there was something there worth saving. Maybe he wasn't just the monster everyone said he was. This wasn't the only time Dean had quietly refused to participate in the cruelty that Hollywood and Vegas accepted as normal business. A stagehand at Paramount remembered the day a director screamed at a young actress until she was shaking, berating her in front of 100 crew members for missing a mark. Dean had been in his trailer, supposedly napping between takes. He emerged, still in his robe, walked directly to the director, and said with that same easy smile, "I think we're done for the day." Not a suggestion. The set went dark. Production lost $50,000. Dean never mentioned it again, but the actress worked steadily for the next 30 years. There was the time a Vegas club owner tried to stiff the backup musicians, claiming budget overruns. Dean heard about it from a saxophone player during a cigarette break. The next night, Dean simply didn't show up for the performance. No explanation, no negotiation. The club lost a fortune on the empty showroom. By morning, every musician had been paid in full with bonuses. Dean walked back on stage that evening as if nothing had happened. But every player in that orchestra understood they'd just witnessed power used to protect the powerless. The pattern was always the same. Dean didn't fight with volume or spectacle. He fought with absence, with withdrawal, with boundaries set quietly and held absolutely. While Frank would explode and Sammy would negotiate, Dean would just stop. Stop performing. Stop smiling. Stop being the thing everyone wanted him to be. In a business built on desperate need for approval, his willingness to walk away gave him a kind of power that terrified studios and casinos more than any tantrum ever could. The public never saw this side of him. They saw the lazy crooner who couldn't be bothered to care about anything. What they missed was the exhausting precision required to maintain that illusion, the constant vigilance needed to make carelessness look effortless. The real Dean Martin was stone-cold sober, watching everything, carrying everyone's expectations like stones in his pockets, absorbing the anxieties of those around him, and diffusing tension with humor that cost him more than anyone knew. After his son Dean Paul died in that fighter jet crash, the mask finally shattered beyond repair. The shows stopped. The jokes dried up. The man who'd spent 50 years making everything look easy suddenly couldn't pretend anymore. But that note, carefully preserved in a dead man's wallet, remained as proof that once, in a city built on fear and compromise, someone had believed a killer was capable of understanding simple dignity. Dean would never brag about writing it. He'd probably deny the whole story with a self-deprecating shrug. But the fact that a dangerous man kept his words closer than a weapon said everything about who Dean Martin really was when the spotlight went dark. The years after the Rat Pack's golden age felt like watching a magician slowly forget his tricks. Dean kept performing through the 70s and into the 80s, but something fundamental had shifted. The audiences still came, still laughed at the right moments, still applauded when he hit those familiar notes. But the people who'd known him longest could see what the tourists couldn't. The weight behind the wink had grown heavier, the mask more difficult to wear. The distance between Dino Crescetti and Dean Martin stretching into a canyon that exhausted him to cross every single night. By the time the neon of old Vegas began to flicker and die, replaced by mirrored glass and corporate logos, Dean was already slipping into his own kind of twilight. The sands came down in a cloud of dust and memory in 1996. The Copa room vanished beneath wrecking balls, and the desert that had once echoed with his laughter learned a colder, emptier silence. After his son Dean Paul's plane fell from the sky in 1987, something essential in him cracked quietly down the middle. The man who had spent 5 decades turning pain into a punchline could no longer find the strength to turn grief into music. He outlived Sammy, who passed in 1990, but Dean had already retreated years before, pulling back from a spotlight that had always felt too bright, too demanding, too hungry for pieces of himself he no longer had to give. The man who'd made intimacy with millions look effortless spent his final years in careful isolation, as if all those decades of generosity had finally emptied the well. The central irony of Dean Martin's life remains almost too perfect to believe. He became world famous playing a drunk who didn't care about anything, when the truth was he stayed stone cold sober and cared about everything. He just cared quietly, in margins and shadows, in moments the cameras never captured and the gossip columns never reported. A waitress at his favorite Italian restaurant recalled how he would sit alone for hours, watching families eat, sometimes paying their checks anonymously before slipping out the back door. A young musician who met him in a hospital waiting room remembered Dean listening to his demo tape right there in the hallway, offering genuine encouragement when he could have just signed an autograph and walked away. A security guard would show his granddaughter an old backstage pass with Dean's hurried signature and the words "Thanks for keeping us safe" scrawled underneath. These stories exist in the gaps between the official narrative, testimonies from people who had no reason to lie and every reason to forget. But they remembered because those small acts of decency carried weight that decades couldn't erode. In a business built on ego and exploitation, Dean Martin's quiet integrity was so unusual it felt revolutionary, even though he never framed it that way, never used his kindness as currency or leverage. The Copa room is gone now, demolished along with the Sands Hotel, imploded in a cloud of dust and nostalgia to make room for the newer, shinier version of Vegas that has no memory and less soul. But somewhere in a federal evidence locker, or maybe in a grandson's careful keeping, that note still exists. A piece of hotel stationery with words that stopped a war. Proof that authenticity carries weight even in a city built entirely on beautiful lies. The next time you see footage of Dean Martin on stage, making it all look like gorgeous accident, that stumbling grace and careless charm, remember the note. Remember the man who understood that the quietest no can be the loudest statement of all. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, and that performance cost him more than any audience ever knew. But in the end, he proved something that Vegas was built to disprove, that you can survive in a world of compromises without compromising who you are. And if you think this is the only time Dean Martin's quiet integrity changed lives in ways the history books forgot, you haven't heard about the night he stopped a television taping to defend a young comedian everyone else had written off. That's a story for another time, but it starts the same way, with a man who refused to let the darkness of the world change who he was, one carefully chosen word at a time.